Ever wished learning English was as fun as reading a good story? Well, today's the day. The English Voice Club brings you an engaging tale to boost your language skills. Let's learn and enjoy. The smell of oil paint lingered thick in the air, mingling with the faint scent of turpentine and the quiet hum of the small town that surrounded her. To anyone passing by, the modest cottage would have seemed like just another home tucked away behind a garden of wildflowers. But inside, the walls were covered with portraits, landscapes and still lifes, each one an echo of something deeper, something unsettling. And in the far corner of the room, a canvas stood alone, still untouched, waiting for the stroke of the brush that would change everything. Evelyn Martin had always been an artist. From a young age, she had known that her hands could make things come to life in ways that few could understand. Her talent was extraordinary, of course. The kind of talent that earned her praise from critics and admiration from friends. But there was something more in her work, something she could never quite explain, something that went beyond mere technique. She had never wanted to leave her small town, not because she loved it, though she did, but because the quiet solitude fed her creativity. Here, in the corners of her home, she could create entire worlds. Her paintings were often filled with figures she had never met, landscapes she had never seen, but it was the people in those paintings that held her attention the most. They were never just lifeless images, frozen in time. There was always something in their eyes, something in their posture that made them seem real. She could never put her finger on it, but it was as if they were waiting for her to finish the picture so that they could step into the world. But lately, something had changed. Her art had begun to feel like more than just a craft. It was becoming something else. The figures she painted seemed to have a life of their own, a presence that lingered far longer than she expected. Evelyn wasn't sure when it started, exactly. Perhaps it had been when she painted the man in the black coat, a tall, sombre figure, his eyes deep and dark. She had worked on him for hours, painstakingly blending the colours on the canvas, making sure every detail was perfect. When she stepped back to admire her work, something felt different. For the first time, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. At first, she chalked it up to her imagination. After all, she was an artist, and it was only natural for her to get lost in her creations. But then, the man in the black coat began to appear in the room when she wasn't looking. A fleeting shadow, a reflection in the glass of a nearby window. She would turn around, expecting to see him standing in the doorway, but nothing was there. One evening, after a long day of painting, Evelyn felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. She had painted for hours, lost in the rhythm of the brush until she had almost forgotten the world outside. When she finally glanced at her clock, the hands were frozen at 2 a.m. and her body ached as though she had been working for days. She stumbled to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, hoping to shake off the strange tension that had crept into the air. But as she moved past her studio, she noticed something odd. The door to the room was open just a crack. She was certain she had closed it before. Curiosity piqued. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Her eyes immediately fell on the canvas she had been working on, the one with the tall figure in the black coat. Her heart skipped a beat. The man was standing just slightly off-center. His eyes, his piercing, intense eyes, now seemed to follow her every movement. She blinked, stepped back and looked again. Nothing. Shaking her head, she attributed it to fatigue. But even as she went back to bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The world she had been painting was no longer confined to the boundaries of the canvas. It was seeping into the corners of her reality, inch by inch. Evelyn wasn't the kind of person to give in to superstitions. She was rational, practical, but the strange occurrences kept happening. The man in the black coat was just the beginning. Soon, other figures began to appear. A woman in a flowing red dress, a child with bright, innocent eyes, a group of laughing teenagers in a field of wildflowers. They all started to show up in her paintings, but they didn't stay confined to their frames. They watched her from the shadows. She would walk past the canvas and swear she could hear the faintest whisper of a voice or catch a fleeting glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. At first, Evelyn thought she was losing her mind. But then things began to escalate. One morning, after a restless night of fitful dreams, she walked into her studio to find that her latest painting had changed. It was a small landscape, a peaceful scene of a winding river and towering mountains. Yet, when she looked closer, the river seemed to shimmer, and there, standing at the edge, gazing out over the water, was a figure. A man, not unlike the one in the black coat, but this time he was real. He was standing there in the middle of the painting, as if he had been there all along, waiting for her to notice. And she did notice. She couldn't stop staring at him, her breath caught in her chest. His eyes were different now, full of intent, as if they were beckoning her, pulling her into the scene. She reached out to touch the canvas, half expecting to feel the cool, smooth surface of the painting beneath her fingers. But instead, she felt warmth. The surface of the painting rippled as though it were made of water, and her fingers sank into the texture as if it were soft, flesh-like. Evelyn jerked her hand back, her heart racing. She stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in the process. The figure in the painting did not move, but his eyes, they were still watching her. She had to know. She had to know what was happening. But as Evelyn stepped closer to the canvas once more, she knew, deep in her gut, that the world she had created was no longer confined to the realm of art. The figures in her paintings were coming to life, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep them at bay. This was only the beginning. The world she had painted was about to collide with her own in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Evelyn stood frozen in front of the painting, her fingers still trembling from the shock of what she had just experienced. The warmth from the canvas lingered in her fingertips, like the ghost of an embrace, and the figure's eyes were still locked on hers. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. Was it real? Was she losing her mind? A sound from behind her made her spin around. The sudden noise broke through the silence of the room, a loud thud that echoed off the walls. Her pulse spiked as she whirled around to face the source. It came from the other side of the room. Her easel had fallen over. The large canvas she had been working on the night before was now on the floor, its corner crumpled, paint smeared across the wooden boards. The figure in the landscape had moved. Her heart raced as she bent down to lift the fallen canvas. As she straightened, her eyes locked onto the figure in the painting. This time, it wasn't just a vague silhouette. He was fully formed, standing tall with his back to her, looking out over the river he had once only stared into. It was the same man, the one from her dreams, from her earlier paintings, the one who had been beckoning her. He wasn't just a painting anymore. He was alive. Evelyn's legs gave way beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her breath catching in her throat. What was happening? She thought she was dreaming, but the reality of it was too vivid, too real. "Get up, Evelyn," she whispered to herself, shaking her head as if the words alone would snap her out of it. She had to think. She had to make sense of this. It wasn't possible. No, it couldn't be. Yet here she was, surrounded by art that was no longer bound by the laws of reality. The room grew colder, a chill seeping into the air. Evelyn glanced toward the window, noticing that the light outside had begun to fade. The sun had barely begun its descent when she had entered the studio earlier. Now the room was shrouded in shadows, and something felt off, too still, too quiet, as if the world outside had stopped. Her eyes darted back to the painting. The figure in the landscape was still there, but now it seemed to be waiting. The longer she stared, the more unnerving it became. His presence was almost tangible. She felt as if his eyes were boring into her, daring her to do something, anything. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound was sharp and insistent, shattering the tension in the room. Evelyn jumped, startled. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Slowly, cautiously, she stood and made her way toward the door. Her hand hesitated over the doorknob as another knock came, louder this time. Her heartbeat quickened, the weight of the uncertainty pressing on her chest. What if it was one of them? What if the people in her paintings were coming for her? Evelyn opened the door, half expecting to see something or someone completely different. But there, standing in the doorway, was a woman. She was young, dressed in a light blue dress with auburn hair that cascaded down her back in loose waves. Her face was familiar, but Evelyn couldn't place her at first. "Can I help you?" Evelyn's voice came out in a whisper, still unsteady from the shock of everything that had happened. The woman smiled, though there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "I know this might sound strange, but I need your help. I've been looking for you." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Looking for her? The words sounded as though they came from a dream. She could swear she had seen this woman somewhere before. Her face was so familiar. Then it hit her. This woman standing in front of her was the same woman she had painted months ago, the one with the flowing red dress. Evelyn's mind raced. Was this real? Was this woman, this figure, somehow part her world now? The world she had created on canvas? "Who are you?" Evelyn's voice trembled as she took a step back, her eyes darting toward the studio behind her. Was the woman real, or was she just another character from her paintings walking out of the frame and into her life? "I don't have much time," the woman said, her gaze flickering nervously toward the window. "But I need to tell you something. It's about the paintings, about what's happening. You have to stop painting." The words landed like a weight in Evelyn's chest, cold and heavy. "What do you mean? Stop painting?" She laughed, though it came out shaky. "I'm an artist. That's all I know. I can't just stop." The woman's face hardened and her voice grew more insistent. "If you don't, everything will collapse. The world you've painted, it's not just a picture. It's real. You're bringing things to life, Evelyn, and they're starting to break free." Evelyn's mind reeled, and her gaze flickered back to the studio. The figure from the painting was still there, unmoving, but now the edges of his form seemed to blur, as if the canvas could no longer contain him. The woman's words cut through the tension like a knife. "You're the only one who can stop it." The woman's voice cracked, desperate. "You need to destroy the paintings. Destroy them before they—" Before she could finish, the door slammed open. Evelyn spun around, startled, and saw the figure from the painting standing in the doorway. His eyes, dark and intense, locked onto hers. The woman shrieked, stumbling backward as the figure stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with an oppressive weight. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure's voice was low, cold, an unmistakable warning. "Please," the woman cried out, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean." But her voice faltered as the figure reached out a hand and the light in the room dimmed, the shadows swallowing everything. Evelyn's world had just tilted into chaos. There was no turning back now. She had to do something, anything, to stop this. The paintings were no longer just art, they were a doorway, and the people inside weren't content to stay there anymore. The air in Evelyn's small cottage grew heavy with an unsettling stillness as the figure from the painting stepped fully into the room. His presence was overwhelming, and Evelyn felt the walls closing in around her. The woman in the doorway recoiled in terror, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure repeated, his voice low and hollow, as though it came from the depths of some dark abyss. He stepped forward, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, as if bending to his will. Evelyn's heart raced, and her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. "Please," the woman cried, her hands raised in a pleading gesture. "I never wanted this. I didn't mean to bring him here." But the man did not seem to hear her. His cold eyes fixed on Evelyn, his gaze a silent command. He was a force of nature, an entity that had no place in her world. And yet, here he was, breathing the same air. Evelyn's mind spun wildly, grappling with what was happening. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out, though the words felt small, useless. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flickered, as though evaluating her. "You made me," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it filled the room with such intensity that Evelyn felt it in her bones. "Now you will face the consequences." Evelyn couldn't breathe. She backed away, her hands outstretched as if to ward him off, but the figure didn't move. The woman, the red-dressed woman, was still in the doorway, frozen in place, as though she too was trapped in some invisible force field. I didn't mean for this to happen," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted to bring anything to life. It's just my paintings. I only painted. You brought them here," the figure interrupted, his voice rising like the tide before a storm. "Now they will live." and they will never leave. The air in the room seemed to tighten further, pressing on Evelyn's chest. She gasped for air, her thoughts racing. She couldn't let him stay. She couldn't let whatever this was destroy her life. But what could she do? She was just an artist. She had no power, no control over what she had created. Suddenly, the woman in the doorway spoke again, her voice shaking. "Evelyn, you need to listen to me. You have to get rid of them, before it's too late." The figure in the room narrowed his eyes, and Evelyn felt a shift in the atmosphere. Something dark, sinister, was beginning to unfurl. "You think you can control us?" he asked, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "You can't. You never could." A sharp, painful chill swept through the room. Evelyn felt as though the temperature had dropped 50 degrees in an instant. The figure stepped closer, his footfalls making no sound on the floor, his eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. The woman's voice cracked with fear. "I didn't know what would happen when I stepped into the painting. I didn't know it would bring us here, but I'm not the only one. They're all coming." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. "All coming?" The woman nodded, her face pale and filled with dread. "You don't understand. The others, they've already started to come. The people in your paintings, they're real now, and they're not all like him." The figure in front of them, the man in the black coat, sneered. "They will learn. I will make them understand." The woman's eyes shifted, glancing nervously at the door. "You need to stop painting. You need to destroy them before it's too late. You don't know what they're capable of." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "We're not the only ones who can cross into this world, Evelyn. The ones you've painted, they can cross into yours." The figure in the black coat, the one who had spoken earlier, tilted his head, watching her with a predatory calm. "Paintings?" he repeated. "You should have known, Evelyn. You should have realized that when you gave life to us, you gave us a piece of your own soul, and now that piece is ours." The room grew colder still, the temperature dropping with each passing moment. Evelyn could feel the chill crawling under her skin, making her limbs feel heavy. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the figures in front of her were no longer just standing still. They were moving. Slowly, purposefully, they were closing in on her, surrounding her. But Evelyn didn't move. She couldn't. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything she had painted, everything she had created with her hands, was now out of her control. Her mind flashed back to the woman who had warned her, the one who had begged her to destroy the paintings before it was too late. The woman was still there, shaking in the corner, her eyes wide with fear, but even she seemed helpless against the onslaught of her own creations. Evelyn's thoughts raced, a million different ideas flashing through her mind. What could she do? How could she stop this madness? The answer came to her in a single horrifying realization. The only way to stop this was to destroy the very paintings she had brought to life. But how? How could she destroy them? These were her creations, her art, her passion. It felt like cutting off a part of herself. Yet, the more she looked at them, the more she understood that there was no other way. She had to destroy them, or they would destroy everything she had known. "No," Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking. The figure in the red dress reached out, and Evelyn took another step back. "Please don't." The woman smiled, a cruel, twisted smile, and took another step. "It's too late for mercy. You made us real, Evelyn. And now we are going to take everything you have. Your world, your art, your soul." Evelyn's heart raced as she glanced around, looking for something, anything that could help her. Her eyes landed on the canvas easel in the corner of the room, the unfinished painting, the one that had begun all of this. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, her legs trembling beneath her. The figures seemed to hesitate for a moment, almost as if surprised by her sudden action. She reached the easel, her hands shaking as she grabbed the brush. She didn't have time to think. She had to act. The brush, once an instrument of creation, now felt like a weapon. The woman in the red dress lunged at her, but Evelyn swung the brush wildly, a desperate strike aimed at the canvas. The paint splattered onto the surface with a sickening splat, and for a moment nothing happened. But then the paint began to twist. The colours bled together, swirling, transforming. The image that had been painted on the canvas, the figure of the woman in red, started to shift, distort, her form warping in response to the movement of the brush. The other figures in the room began to react as well, their features contorting, their bodies becoming more erratic, as if the paint had a life of its own. Evelyn felt her pulse pounding in her ears as she continued to paint, each stroke more frantic than the last. She was no longer thinking. She was acting on instinct, on desperation. She had to break the bond between her and these creations. She had to destroy the illusion, sever the connection. "You can't undo it, Evelyn," the man in the black coat shouted, his voice full of rage. "You can't destroy us!" But Evelyn didn't stop. She painted harder, faster, her strokes becoming wild, as if she were trying to erase every trace of the figures that had come to life. She didn't care what happened to the canvas anymore. She didn't care if she ruined her art. She needed to break free from this nightmare. She felt a small shift in her chest, a quiet, painful reminder that things had changed. She was different now. The world she had known before had slipped away, replaced by something far darker, something far more dangerous. But there was a glimmer of something else too. The connection, the bond she had with her creations, was broken. She had regained control over her work, over her life. Slowly, she turned toward the canvas again, the emptiness staring back at her. The paint had dried now, its surface hardened, frozen. Evelyn took a cautious step forward, her fingers trembling as she reached out. The brush in her hand felt foreign, a tool she no longer trusted. It was a part of her, but now it felt like something dangerous, something to be handled with care. "Maybe it's time to let go," she murmured to herself, her voice thick with emotion. "Maybe I should stop painting." "No," the woman spoke, her voice firm yet gentle. "You can't stop, Evelyn. You have a gift, but you need to learn to control it. It's not the paint that's the problem. It's the way you let it control you." Evelyn nodded slowly, though she didn't feel convinced. It was hard to see the beauty in something that had nearly destroyed her life. But she could feel the truth in the woman's words. She didn't have to stop painting. She just needed to learn to create in a way that wasn't dangerous, art that wasn't alive, that didn't bend reality. She could learn to keep the boundary between her art and the world solid, unyielding. Her mind drifted back to the moment when the figures had started to come to life. The brush had been the key, but it had also been her undoing. Every stroke had been an invitation, a call to something more powerful, more alive than she had ever imagined. But it was also the key to her salvation. The same brush that had created the nightmare was what had pushed it all away. She had reclaimed her power over it. Evelyn turned her back to the canvas, facing the woman now. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "What do I do now?" The woman smiled softly. "You start over, you rebuild, but this time you'll be ready." Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decisions settle into her bones. She couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could move forward. The woman extended a hand to her, and Evelyn hesitated for a moment before reaching out to take it. "You're not alone anymore," the woman said gently. "We'll figure it out together." As the two of them stood there, surrounded by the remains of Evelyn's work, the silence between them felt less oppressive. There was a sense of understanding now, a bond forged not in the horrors of what had happened, but in the quiet acceptance of what was yet to come. They would rebuild, both of them, though the path ahead was uncertain. Evelyn looked around the room, the pieces of her shattered world. The once chaotic space now felt still, almost sacred. The remnants of the paintings that had been alive, now just fragments of colour, of energy. She would never forget what had happened, but she also knew that she could never allow it to define her. "What do I do with the rest of my paintings?" Evelyn asked quietly, her gaze lingering on the few pieces that still hung on the walls. The woman's eyes softened. "The rest of them, they're yours to decide. But you don't have to do it alone." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn felt the faintest spark of hope flicker inside her. The nightmare was over, but the journey was far from finished. There was so much left to create, so much left to discover. With a deep breath, Evelyn turned away from the canvas, leaving it behind. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it, whatever it might be. The past was behind her, and the future was waiting, full of endless possibilities. And maybe this time she would paint something beautiful. The days that followed the destruction of the living paintings were filled with quiet, steady work. Evelyn had spent countless hours sitting in front of the canvas, her brushes poised above the surface, her mind a swirling tempest of doubt and fear. The events that had unfolded seemed almost impossible to believe. How could something she had created, something meant to be a representation of beauty, turn into a force so dangerous, so alive? The woman in the red dress shrieked, her body beginning to flicker and fade with every stroke of the brush. The child in the tattered dress reached out with hands that were now nothing more than blackened, twisted limbs. But they couldn't reach her. No matter how they moved, how they tried to advance, the paint kept pushing them back, distorting their forms, turning them into nothing more than grotesque, distorted images. The man in the black coat, the one who had been the source of this madness, stepped forward again, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can erase us?" he spat. "You think you can destroy what is already alive?" Evelyn felt a surge of power inside her as she painted with renewed determination. The figures in the room seemed to writhe in agony, their forms becoming more and more distorted with each brush stroke. It was as if the very act of painting, of creating, was now the key to breaking their hold on reality. With one final desperate push, Evelyn swept the brush across the canvas one last time. The room seemed to shake, the very foundations of the house groaning in protest as the figures in the room let out one final anguished scream. Then all at once they began to crumble, their bodies disintegrating into nothing more than streaks of paint, fading into the air like smoke. Evelyn stood there, breathless and exhausted, staring at the canvas. The room was silent now, the oppressive weight of the figures gone. The painting, once full of life, now hung there, a ghost of its former self. It was over. But as Evelyn looked at the faded image on the canvas, she couldn't help but wonder, had she truly destroyed them? Or had she simply pushed them back into the shadows, waiting for the next time her hand touched a brush? For now, at least, the room was still. And Evelyn, breathing heavily, had won. The silence that followed the disintegration of the figures was almost deafening. Evelyn stood there, her body trembling, her breath ragged in the stillness. The room, once filled with movement and chaos, was now eerily calm. The paint splattered across the canvas looked almost peaceful, its colours muted as if the life had been drained from them. It was as though the very essence of the nightmare had been wiped away, leaving only the remnants of what once was. For a long moment, Evelyn did nothing but breathe. She was afraid to move, afraid that if she did, the world would shift again, the nightmare would return. She looked at the floor where the figures had been moments before. There was nothing left, no traces of them, no sign of their presence, except for the lingering chill in the air. She swallowed hard, fighting the nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. It was over. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. "I did it," she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. It sounded weak, shaky, as if she hadn't fully accepted the enormity of what had just happened. The truth was, she wasn't sure she had truly won, or if she had simply delayed the inevitable. She glanced at the canvas again, her heart pounding. It had all started there, with a single stroke of paint, a fleeting idea brought to life. What had she done to the world? The woman in the corner, the one who had warned her from the beginning, stood up slowly, her eyes still wide with fear, but also with a flicker of something else, relief. "You did it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You stopped them." Evelyn turned to her, still disoriented. "But are they really gone? I can still feel them inside me. What if I created something even worse? What if it wasn't enough?" The woman, who had introduced herself only as a fellow artist when Evelyn had found her, gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "No, it's done. You severed the connection. They're gone. But they'll always be a part of you now." She hesitated, then added, "But you survived, and that's what matters." Evelyn stared at her for a long time, her mind still reeling. The weight of what she had done was too much to grasp all at once. She had created them, these figures, these living nightmares. And now she had destroyed them. But what remained? What was left of her art? One afternoon she found herself painting something new, something she had never thought she would do. A self-portrait. Not one that captured her pain or the fear she had felt in the past, but a portrait that reflected who she was now. There on the canvas, she painted herself, smiling, serene with the brush in her hand. The woman she had become was calm, confident, and most of all, at peace. As the final strokes were added to the painting, Evelyn stepped back and surveyed her work. She felt no fear now, only a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had faced the darkness, battled with her own creations, and survived. And in doing so, she had learned a lesson that would stay with her forever. It wasn't the world around her that needed to change. It was her own perspective, her own understanding of her place in it. With a soft smile, Evelyn placed the brush down beside her canvas. She had no illusions about the future. The world would always be unpredictable. Life would always present new challenges. But she was no longer afraid of them. She had learned to face the chaos with calm, to control the art without letting it control her. And as she looked at her self-portrait, she understood something else. Sometimes the greatest work of art you can create is the person you become. But she had learned something in the process. Her gift, her curse, wasn't a thing to be feared. It was a part of her, and she could control it. Slowly, piece by piece, Evelyn began to rebuild. The woman who had helped her, guided her through the chaos, became a fixture in Evelyn's life, offering her support, wisdom, and quiet encouragement. Together, they worked in the studio, but unlike before, the work was no longer a frantic, chaotic effort to escape something. It had become a meditation, a healing. Every brushstroke was deliberate, each colour chosen with care. The shadows of her past creations had not completely vanished from her mind, nor from her heart. She knew deep down that the events had changed her. They had marked her in ways she couldn't undo. But the fear was gone, replaced by an understanding, one that was still taking root, still growing in the quiet spaces between each brushstroke. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the studio, Evelyn sat back from her canvas. She had painted something different this time, a scene of peacefulness and light. The figures, this time, were calm, at peace. They seemed to breathe, but there was no fear in their movement, no danger. They lived, but they did not disrupt. Evelyn allowed herself a moment of quiet pride as she surveyed the scene she had created. "You've come a long way," the woman said, her voice soft and approving. Evelyn didn't need to ask if she was referring to the painting or to her own journey. She could see it in the way the lines of the painting were softer, the colour more controlled. It was a reflection of her own growth. "I didn't know if I could do this," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I had lost everything, that I was too far gone." The woman smiled gently, her eyes filled with understanding. "You've never been lost, Evelyn. You just had to learn how to find yourself again." Evelyn felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't from sorrow. It was the release of the tension, the weight she had carried for so long, finally lifting. She had been on the edge of something terrifying, but now she stood at the precipice of something new, something hopeful. Later that night, after the studio had grown quiet and the last of the sunlight faded from the sky, Evelyn walked out onto the balcony. The cool night air brushed against her skin, and for the first time in months she didn't feel the suffocating weight of fear. The horizon before her felt open, limitless. In the distance, the faint outline of a city glittered on the edge of the world. She had lived in that city once. It had been her home, a place where she'd first discovered her love for painting, for art. Now, as she stared at it, Evelyn realised that while it had been a place of beginnings, it no longer felt like a place of belonging. The world outside her studio was vast, but her world, the world she had built here, in the quiet of the studio with the brush in her hand, was enough. She didn't need the city, the recognition, the fame. She had learned that what she needed was the peace of her own mind, the quiet joy of creation, and the understanding that her art, though powerful, could also be beautiful and controlled. "I think it's time to move on," she murmured to herself, feeling a sense of certainty in her bones. The woman who had been her guide nodded, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. "You've made peace with your gift. You've found balance. Now you can decide what comes next." Evelyn smiled, the weight of her past lifting in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so long afraid of her own power, afraid of what it could do, of what it could become. But now she understood it wasn't her power that was dangerous, it was her fear of it. Now she had learned how to face that fear. As the days passed, Evelyn continued to paint, but now there was no urgency in her work, no frantic need to escape or control. She painted because she loved it, because it was a part of her. Each painting became more intricate, more detailed, and yet there was no chaos, no fear of what might spring to life from the brush.